Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to learn all about inflation. First, the fundamental terms. What do the words even mean? Then what are the costs and consequences of inflation? Who's helped? Who's hurt by inflation? What are some big social issues related to inflation? And then finally, how do we measure inflation? So we got a lot on our plate. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the first section is really just what are some basic terms to know when it talks about inflation. So I'm going to give you 5 of them that you need to know. Some of them you have heard already. So the first is inflation itself, right? What does this word mean, inflation? And it means that there's an overall increase in overall prices, right? Overall doesn't mean that everything did the same, right? It just means that overall prices went up by a certain amount, right? We've kind of weighted an average in a way. It also means that the purchasing power of your money is less. When we say purchasing power, it means how much you can buy with your money, right? How much we can buy, how much we can buy. And we would say we can buy less when prices are higher because literally stuff's more expensive. It's harmful when it's very, very high. So when inflation rates are high, this can be very painful, right? So when high percent, we'll say, from a year ago. So if you have a really high rate of change in prices, it can be damaging. We'll get to that in a second. Disinflation means you're bringing down the rate of increase. So it would be like if we went from, say, a 6% to a 3%. Right? You still have inflation because 3% would mean prices are going up 3%, but it's at a lower rate than what it used to be. So if we say disinflation, it just means we're bringing down the rate. Deflation actually means that the prices are decreasing, right? So a difference from disinflation here, it literally means like a negative percent is what that means. So it would mean that everything got cheaper. Now, initially, you might think that that's a great idea, but in fact, it's really bad. Higher purchasing power. You go, why was that bad? I can buy more stuff. Well, the problem is that it often is very damaging for businesses. When there's deflation, a business can't sell goods and services for the price that it anticipated being able to sell them for. And as a result, that business has much lower profitability. And often, if you think about a business that's operating on very thin profit margins, if they aren't able to charge the price that they expected, if the price has to drop quite a bit for goods that they didn't expect, then they could actually lose money by doing those transactions. And rather than do that, they would just not sell the goods at all. And so they close the doors and wait the problem out. The issue with that is that when they close the doors, they lay off more workers, and then the deflation gets worse. And so deflation is a vicious cycle that actually it can really derail an entire economy very, very quickly. So in fact, negative is really, really not the goal here. And that's in fact why we have a goal of a positive number, right? Why we don't have a goal of 0 is because of the risk of deflation, right? Risk. So not 0. So the goal is not 0 because of the risk of deflation is really what it is. Now, there are 2 other words that we need to know. We've used them before, nominal and real. Nominal means it's a named change. So if I said it's your nominal change in GDP, it means it's in that named year's prices. If I said it's your nominal change in your wage, it's just the named change. So if I gave you a 10% raise, that's your nominal raise, right, in your wage. If I said it's a nominal interest rate, it just means it's the named interest rate. Now, real means it's something that's adjusted for inflation. And so we talked about GDP being real by taking into account changes in prices. When we talk about other things like wages and interest rates, we can figure out what those are by just taking the nominal value and subtracting out the inflation rate. So for example, if I said that I give you a nominal wage increase of 10% higher, and I said the inflation rate was 3%, then your real wage only went up 7%, right? So you can kind of use this tool, nominal minus inflation equals real, to figure out what's the real value of maybe a paycheck increase. Or if I was charging you interest on a loan, you would do the same process. I would say the named interest rate that I'm charging you is, say, 10%. But the inflation rate is 3, which means that you're really only paying an interest rate of 7%. And that's a really fundamental, important thing to understand, is the inflation rate is eroding kind of this nominal number. It's reducing it, and that's how we would make that adjustment, right? So it's actually a little bit easier to do this adjustment than what we did for real GDP. Now, there's an impact on inflation on wages and interest rates that kind of draws out from that. And what we'd say is that it depends on, is this number, this inflation rate, is it something that we expected or not? Now, if we expected it, then your worker is just going to say, hey, boss, I want you to increase my nominal by whatever the inflation is, and that way my real wage stays the same. So if both me and the boss think the inflation rate's going to be 3% this year, and I'm not going to get a real raise, well, the boss has to pay me 3% more in nominal terms just so that my real wage stays where it's at, just so that I can buy the same amount of stuff. Because if they didn't increase my nominal wage by that 3%, then my real wage would actually go down by 3%. I would actually be getting a pay cut. I wouldn't be able to buy as much stuff. So generally, we say when expected inflation rates are what they end up, what we expect them to be, when actual inflation rates are what we expect, then it's kind of a wash. The inflation doesn't really affect very much because it's already built into these, right? The same is true for loans. We would say that there's an expected inflation rate. When a lender makes a loan and when a borrower borrows money, they actually have an expected inflation rate in their head. And if that meets that expectation, then there's no real impact of inflation on that loan. But when there's unexpected inflation, that's when it can hurt and when it can help people. So let's kind of take a look at what that would mean. Let's say that we gave you a nominal wage increase of 3%, and we expected to have a 2% increase in prices. We expected that. So we expect a 1% real wage increase, right? But if the actual inflation rate was 5% instead, well, what does that do? It makes my real wages actually negative 2%. Right? Because 3 minus 5 is negative 2. So it actually caused my unexpected inflation. It hurt me as a fixed income earner, right? So if I'm on a fixed income, if it's not adjusting with inflation very much, if I sign a contract, and in fact I do, Glossinger signs a contract where my wages are actually negotiated for 2 years, right? 2 years at a time. There are even 3-year union contracts out there where you would sign a percentage agreement for the next 3 years. And if inflation were to go way higher than what you expect, that could make the real value of those wages much lower. Now, this is another way we could think about it would be the opposite way, right? If we said nominal interest rate of 3% and a 2% inflation rate, then we expect there to be a 1% real interest rate on a loan. So we would say you're really only paying 1%. But if the actual inflation rate was 5%, then your real interest rate drops. It goes from 1% to negative 2%, just in the same way. But this unexpected inflation here is going to help the borrower because the borrower is literally paying negative interest rates. That means that they're getting free money to take out this loan. Right. And so a negative interest rate would be really great if you're a borrower, but it would be really painful if you're a lender. And lenders, by extension, are all savers, right? A lender is somebody who has money, who saved it. And negative interest rates means that their value of their money is shrinking. So again, unexpected inflation can have some impacts in terms of people's wages and in terms of loans. And being aware of what those unexpected impacts would be is pretty valuable. Note that if it goes the other direction, it can be unexpectedly beneficial, right? So if the inflation rate were to be much smaller, if we expected it to be 2 and it was 0, then it actually makes my real wages go up. If, for example, we expected inflation to be 2 and it was 0 for this, it makes my real interest rate go up. And so it can go both ways, right? Unexpected inflation can go up or it can be below what we expected it to be. Now, setting aside all of this notion about expectations and like that piece, there are general costs of inflation to know. These are more just vocab terms to be familiar with. Shoe leather, menu, and unit of account. And very briefly, these are general costs of inflation that accrue to society regardless of it being expected or unexpected. And in short, shoe leather costs are the cost to consumers. This is kind of a way to say it's consumers. And consumers bear a cost in inflation because they have to run around and do transactions before their money is not worth very much. They literally wear out the leather in their shoes, that's where the name comes from, having to run around and get money out of the bank. They have to run out and they have to purchase things. And they have to do these transactions really quickly because their money is losing its value. And the more inflation there is, the bigger that shoe leather cost is, right? Menu costs, these are costs that accrue to businesses, right? So we have kind of consumers and businesses who are being affected. This is the idea that businesses have to renegotiate contracts when there's high prices changes, right? Like high inflation, a business is going to have to update its menus, literally thinking about like where does it come from the name. As a restaurant, it has to update its menus. And that's wasted time and effort, right, to do all of that. So these are costs of wasting time and effort and money doing these things when you don't really have to. The third is something that's a little bit more abstract. It's called the unit of account. And it's actually the cost to money itself. Money itself performs a function. And one of the functions of money is that we use it as a unit. We use it as a unit of value of an account. And in other words, we say, this pen's maybe worth $10, right? Or this laptop that I'm recording this on, this is worth $1,000. But inflation messes with our ability to make that determination. We don't have the ability of knowing, is this really worth $10? Is this laptop worth $1,000? Because inflation messed up our ability to use money in that way. So it actually makes our transactions less efficient, and it's really a function of money that it messes with. So it's really, this function is called the unit of account and the unit of value function, and it makes it really hard for people to do that. We'll return to unit of account later when we come back and actually talk about what money even is. Now, the last thing on this lesson is, how do we measure inflation? And traditionally, economists use the CPI to measure inflation that's for consumers. There's another measure of the CPI, or another measure of a price index, that's called the producer price index, right? The PPI. The PPI is for businesses. It's like a measure of inflation, basically, that businesses have. But if you're a consumer, we use CPI because consumers, right? That's what people buy. And it's very similar to the GDP deflator, the way we construct it. We would take the value of a basket, a big giant shopping cart of goods and services, and we take the price of that shopping cart in the named year's prices. So we'd say, if we're calculating the CPI, we can calculate this number, this CPI, and then measure percent changes in it. And the way we calculate this CPI number is we take the value of the basket in the named year and we divide it by that same basket of stuff in a base year's prices. So for example, if the base year, or if the 2020 basket was $240 in 2020 prices, but was $200 in 2015 prices, what was the CPI if the base year was 2015? So that's kind of the traditional style of problem you're going to get. So we would say 240 over, right, over 200 times 100. And this would be 120 over 100, right? So it's equal to 120. And so this would tell us that the CPI for 2020 is 120. And we can use that to calculate an inflation rate. So for example, the inflation rate from 2015 to 2020, given the CPI, is 20%. And that's again because a CPI for a base year, just like with GDP deflator, is set to 100. And so we'd say, when we're going new minus old over old times 100, that's just percent change, right? We've been doing this all year. The new value would be 120. Old value is 100 over 100 times 100. And that's because this is the base year, and that's also the base year. And that gives us a 20% change in prices. So we basically do the same process that we did with GDP deflator. We could do it with the CPI, and the CPI is constructed very similarly to that GDP deflator. It's the value in nominal terms divided by the value in the base year terms. Hopefully this helped you with how we measure inflation. We calculate percent changes in the CPI and how we construct the CPI, the different costs of inflation and the effects of especially unexpected inflation. We're going to want to make sure we know this stuff and just our fundamental terms. I'll see you next time.